Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are joining us. Thank you so much for joining for the first keynote talk of Kadir's contemporary debates of 2021 and 2022. We are so thrilled to have Professor Barry Eichengreen for the first talk. And I don't think he needs much introduction, but I'll try to be brief here, because if we go for the full introduction, we will need another seminar slot for that. Barry Eichengreen is a professor of economics and a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and he has been there for a while, as far as I know. He is a research associate at the MBER and a research fellow of the CEPR. And he also has been a senior policy advisor at the IMF in the past. So he is the author of many influential research papers, as well as many influential and best-selling books, two of which I have here with me, actually, so such as The Exorbitant Privilege and Globalizing Capital, and many others. And today he's going to be presenting us his most recent book, the cover of which you see here on the slide, In Defense of Public Debt, where he's going to talk about the history of sovereign debt and the both sides of the coin, but I don't want to give much spoilers and leave the stage to Professor Eichengreen. Let me briefly talk about the format of the seminar. So it will be a 1-hour talk, preferably uninterrupted. In case you have clarification questions, you can either raise your hand or you can type on the chat screen, and I can communicate the questions to Professor Eichengreen. This will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. During the Q&A session, again, please do raise your hands if you want to ask questions, or type on the chat screen. To avoid a chaos, because we are expecting many participants, we have apologetically muted you, but as I said, if you want to ask questions, we will be unmuting you. Let me also remind that the talk will be recorded. And that is all for my part. Professor Eichengreen, thank you again so much for sharing your book with us and being with us here today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you also to Kadir Has University for the opportunity to be with you. I'd much rather be with you in person. Hopefully normalcy will return, permitting travel, among other things, before too long. So it is a nice opportunity to be able to talk about In Defense of Public Debt. I should emphasize that the book is co-authored. So today I'm doing the talking, but the thinking and writing was done in conjunction with my co-authors, Asma El Ghaneni, who's at the International Monetary Fund, Rui Esteves, who's at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and Chris Michener, who is at Santa Clara University down the road from where I am in Berkeley. So the backstory to the book was a commission that we received from actually the IMF, I think it was in 2018, to write a historical chapter about public debt for a conference and a volume that they were organizing. So we undertook that task and came away from it thinking that the debate over public debt was somewhat unbalanced. The recent debate has been dominated by problems of and worries about debt sustainability, difficulties of debt restructuring, and so forth, where if you look at the history of public debt, you see also the positive role that it has played in the development and defense of states, in the development of private financial markets, and therefore in modern economic growth, in helping economies put in place the infrastructure needed for physical infrastructure needed for economic development. So we wanted to provide a more balanced account where we thought the criticisms of governments for incurring excessive amounts of debt had been abundantly argued, but the positive aspects had not been articulated sufficiently, hence our title, In Defense of Public Debt. In reality, we like to think the book is a balanced account that talks about both the uses and misuses of public debt issuance, both the benefits and, under certain circumstances, the costs, but to sell some books and get our readership's attention, we attached to the book this relatively provocative title. If you are of my generation, you will be familiar with the debt clock that has been ticking in Times Square in the United States since the 1990s. For decades now, there has been concern about the level of public debt in the United States and in a variety of other countries. In the United States, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is continuously sounding warnings about the unsustainable trajectory on which US public debt came into existence in 1981, I think, as another indication of mounting concern over public indebtedness. So those worries found their way into the 1990 US Budget Enforcement Act, which was designed to limit the growth of public spending in the United States and increases in public debt. In Europe, they found their way into the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, which had reference points, specifically 60% of GDP as the reference point for public debt for EU member states in order to qualify for membership in the euro area. They had to bring their public debts down to that level or have them approaching that level at an acceptable pace. And we know, of course, that public debts in Europe are far above that level now, as I will remind you. But again, the point of these observations is that there was already widespread worry in the 1980s and 1990s that government spending and debt were dangerously out of control. That consensus at least wobbled in the face of the global financial crisis. In the United States, we adopted the Obama stimulus in 2008, $787 billion fiscal stimulus package to rescue the financial system and minimize the severity of the recession, as a result of which federal government debt in the hands of the public shot up from 36% of GDP at the end of 2008 to 53% of GDP at the end of 2009. A number of European countries saw levels of indebtedness relative to GDP rise even more dramatically. Countries like Ireland had to recapitalize broken banking systems, so they experienced very dramatic increases in indebtedness. But that deviation from fiscal orthodoxy, if you will, seemed to be temporary as soon as recovery was underway. Sometimes even before recovery was fully underway, governments turned back toward austerity, cutting spending, raising taxes. So it was possible to dismiss the events of 2008, 2009 as no more than a temporary deviation from fiscal orthodoxy. Then, of course, came COVID-19. It's said that COVID-19 has changed everything, and it has certainly changed the fiscal landscape in a wide variety of countries. The COVID-19 health emergency and recession led governments around the world to run unprecedented deficits, to accumulate unprecedented levels of debt, unprecedented at least in peacetime. Wartime imperatives are different, and I'll give you some illustrations of that momentarily. In the United States, however, the federal government deficit is currently 13% of GDP. Debt in the hands of the public is over 100% of GDP. Other advanced countries moved in the same direction. Even Germany, traditionally debt and deficit averse, abandoned its debt brake temporarily in favor of a deficit of 4.2% of GDP in 2020, and an even larger deficit in this year in 2021. And there is a debate underway at the moment around the coalition talks in Germany about how soon, how quickly that debt brake should be put back in place, mandating basically a return to budget balance. Across the Euro area as a whole, debt is now more than 100% of GDP, just as it's more than 100% of GDP in the United States. In Europe, then it is far above Maastricht levels. And we can talk a little bit about whether that is a problem or not. And the same is basically true around the world. So I grabbed this figure from the IMF's most recent fiscal monitor, and you can see the growth of debt to GDP ratios in the advanced countries, emerging market economies, low-income countries. The subtitle cautions you to beware the vertical axes because they're not the same across the three figures. Debt to GDP ratios are lower in low-income countries, which have less debt carrying capacity, less capacity to issue and service debt. But you can see that the trend in debt to GDP ratios is strongly upward everywhere. You can see how recent experience stands out, and you can see something else that's directly relevant to this discussion, namely that even though debt to GDP ratios have risen strongly, interest expense, interest payments as a share of GDP have not risen strongly. They've actually come down in the advanced economies and in emerging market economies on average, and they've risen only modestly in low-income developing countries, which pay higher interest rates. So we're going to want to come back to that as well. That speaks, for example, to what I was alluding to before about whether the Maastricht Treaty's 60% of GDP reference value for public debts is still appropriate in the 21st century when interest rates are so much lower than they were back when the treaty was negotiated in 1992. So these observations lead to two obvious questions. Is this more tolerant attitude toward debt accumulation justified? And number two, will it last? On the question of justified, I would argue clearly yes, that extraordinary circumstances like those of a global pandemic justify extraordinary action, including extraordinary fiscal action. A government that doesn't respond to this kind of public health and economic emergency by mobilizing all available resources, including resources that can be mobilized only by issuing debt, will not long retain its legitimacy, will not long retain respect in the eyes of the public. There is this questionable analogy between the household budget and the government budget, which I, despite questions about it, I want to invoke it now for a moment, because I think it's relevant in this context. Just as a responsible household should live within its means, it is said, so too should a responsible government. However, a government that doesn't borrow in order to provide essential services during a deadly pandemic, during a public health emergency, would be accused of dereliction, just like parents who refused to borrow to obtain life-saving surgery for a child would be accused of dereliction. So I would strongly defend the actions taken by governments on the fiscal front in 2020, 2021, or at least most of those actions. Indeed, if you look at the history, you see that states and rulers have long borrowed to meet emergencies. Most obviously, rulers have borrowed to expand their territory, to expand the domain, but also to defend it against hostile invaders and to survive. Borrowing to mount an effective national defense, strengthen the state in the material sense of repelling invaders, but also in a political sense, because a state that provides a sturdy national defense and protects residents against hostile invaders gains legitimacy in the eyes of its public. That is why we see the emergence of sovereign debt first in Europe. We see the emergence of sovereign debt in Western Europe before we see it in China, before we see it in Japan, before we see it in the Ottoman Empire, for reasons of political geography and reasons of physical geography. So I show you here the political map of Europe circa 1200, and you can see that the European continent was divided into literally hundreds of princely kingdoms. Many were no more than cities with modest hinterlands. Some were larger. The famous historical sociologist Charles Tilly, who emphasized this, estimated that average state size circa 1200 was only 25,000 square kilometers, and that political geography flowed from Europe's physical geography as a land mass divided by mountain ranges and river valleys that posed natural obstacles to the formation of more extensive territorial states. So you can contrast this picture of Western Europe with this picture of China, much of which, the Himalayas in the West notwithstanding, is a great plain, which made for a unitary state already in 221 BC, with a uniform written language, a standardized currency, a unitary tax system, and a great wall protecting the territory of the Qing dynasty, at least in part from invaders from the north. So for reasons of geography, that protection from the north and internal unity, China lacked the same need to borrow to finance warfare. So I think if I hadn't mistaken the time zone difference between Berkeley and Istanbul, I would have prepared another picture like this for the Ottoman Empire. And I think you can make the same argument about your part of the world, that internal unity meant that there was less of an imperative to issue sovereign debt to finance wars, although the empire engaged in lots of skirmishes on its western front, but the imperative was less than would have been the case under political circumstances like these. However, sovereigns who wished to borrow had to confront commitment problems. The king, the sovereign occupying the throne, was the supreme earthly power, as well as the embodiment of the state. So Louis XIV of France famously reminded his subjects that I am the state. That unlimited power, however, had the ironic effect of limiting his ability to borrow, because there was nothing to prevent the supreme earthly power from reneging on his obligations to his subjects. So it followed that sovereigns could borrow only from Italian bankers and others for relatively short terms at relatively high interest rates. There were political conditions, therefore, for the development of a market in sovereign debt. Sovereign debt markets began to develop. Sovereign debt began its rise to modern levels only with the imposition of political checks and balances, only with the creation of representative assemblies in which the creditors sat, through which those creditors were empowered to oversee tax collection, approve increases in spending, and authorize the issuance of debt securities. So you see the development of these representative assemblies first in relatively compact polities, Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, and Venice, where it's easy to get the creditors or their representatives together in one room. And then you see them in places developed later in places like the Netherlands and England, where similarly representative assemblies capable of implementing political checks and balances on the sovereign come to develop. And with the development of those political preconditions, real interest rates on sovereign debt begin to come down. So I show you the case of Holland between 1600 and 1750, precisely the period in which the Estates General acquires the power to check arbitrary action by the sovereign. And you can see the decline in real interest rates from the neighborhood of 8% to the neighborhood of 2 or 3% over the century and a half in question, as sovereign debt comes to be recognized as an obligation of the state rather than an obligation of the person occupying the throne, as repayment comes to be expected even after the demise of the individual sovereign who had incurred it. Similarly, there were economic preconditions for the development of a market in sovereign debt. Not only did real interest rates come down over the period, but starting in the 18th and 19th century, economic growth rates go up. So if you've been following discussions, the debate over sovereign debt, you will be familiar with the now famous R minus G, the importance of the difference between the real interest rate and the real growth rate on sovereign debt, which made and the lower that differential, the faster the growth rate relative to the real interest rate, the more sustainable become heavier debts. So you can see on the right, courtesy of my colleague Paul Schmelzing, how the real interest rate, real growth rate differential tended to come down over the course of the 19th century in particular, making higher levels of public debt sustainable, more easily sustainable for governments. So there's a sense, therefore, in which modern public finance, modern levels of public debt are concomitants, go hand in hand with modern economic growth. And I'll have more to say about the relationship between the interest rate and the growth rate as I go forward. The other economic precondition for the development of a market in sovereign debt was, of course, an adequate pool of savings to be invested in the debt securities of governments. So it's not surprising that we see successful placement of public debt in private hands at the same times and in the same places where commercial activity was expanding, creating that pool of private savings. So that means in the commercial centers, naval powers, trading powers like Venice and Genoa, in the Netherlands, then in Britain, all of which were public debt pioneers because, in part, they were naval and commercial pioneers. So another example would be the French towns that were home to the Champagne fairs, illustrated on the right. They were the first places where municipal bonds issued by those self-same towns or their neighbors were successfully issued and marketed, and then where sovereign bonds were disproportionately sold. Finally, there were financial preconditions. Successful debt issuers had to create secondary markets on which debt securities could be bought and sold, allowing investors to hold diversified portfolios thereof, limit their risks, restore their liquidity when the need arose. And successful debt issuers had to create an entity, namely a central bank, to backstop that market and ensure its stability and liquidity. So I show you the case of the Bank of England, established circa 1688 on the right. All of which had implications for private financial markets. As a market develops in safe and liquid, increasingly safe and liquid government debt securities, those same government debt securities begin to be accepted as collateral for other private borrowing and lending. So the development of a market in public debt fosters the development of markets in private debt, fosters the broader process of financial development. There's a large literature now, as everyone knows, about the Great Divergence, about why Europe was first to embark on modern economic growth, why it was the first part of the world to experience modern, sustained economic, financial, and commercial development. So I would not go so far as to assert that Europe's precocious ability to issue public debt is the entire story, but I think it is part of the story, insofar as public debt issuance was conducive to the development of financial markets, and financial development and economic development go hand in hand. Over time, the uses to which public debt has been put have evolved. Financing wars has remained a primary importance throughout. So I show you the debt to GDP ratio for the United States here. And you can see how that the history of that debt to GDP ratio has been punctuated by the War of 1812, the US Civil War, World War I, the World War II, and so forth, how World War I and World War II saw the two largest public debt explosions of the 20th century. But over time, governments have increasingly borrowed also for other purposes, starting in the 19th century for developmental purposes, to invest in the infrastructure associated with modern economic growth. They have borrowed in order to build roads, railways, ports, install urban lighting and sewers. And then in the 20th century, governments have borrowed to finance social programs and transfer payments. So we see increasing deficits, larger deficits, and increasing levels of debt associated with those spending programs after World War I, after in the Great Depression, and most especially in recent decades from the 1970s. This last observation raises an important set of questions. Borrowing to finance infrastructure and investment makes sense. If you invest in productive infrastructure that fosters exports and economic growth, for example, that will translate into more government revenues over time, enhancing the government's ability to service the debt it has incurred in order to build out that infrastructure and repay that debt. So we're having a peculiar debate in the United States at the moment about whether the federal government should issue debt in order to build the physical infrastructure that the country unquestionably requires. And the consensus in the Congress seems to be that we should raise taxes sufficiently to pay now for all that infrastructure investment. I'm not, as an economist, I don't think that's the correct conclusion to draw, but I do think the argument is quite different for transfer payments. Transfer payments are ongoing. Why they haven't been and shouldn't be financed out of current revenues is not obvious. I think the explanation for why many governments in recent decades, starting with that of the United States, have incurred more debt in order to finance transfer payments and so forth. The answer comes under three headings. Number one, there's a tendency for demands for these forms of social spending to rise precisely when revenues fall, when the economy falls on hard times, because of political fractionalization in a fractionalized political system. Each political faction has just enough power to defend its preferred social programs, but not enough power to implement cuts in spending on the preferred programs of others. There is a collective action or a fiscal common pool problem, if you will. And finally, in countries like the United States, we have seen increases in political polarization combined with growing electoral uncertainty. So that this leads politicians to advocate more spending on their favored programs, which are disfavored by other political groups. They advocate more spending on their favored programs when in office, since they'll be in a weaker position to push such spending later when out of office. And the more the preferences of the different political groupings differ, the harder they will push revenue constraints notwithstanding. Then, of course, came COVID-19. And as I said before, the public health emergency was equivalent to war and elicited a warlike fiscal response. For countries like the United States, the question is whether this change in attitudes and fiscal stance will persist. On the one hand, if the change in the fiscal landscape is simply the product of COVID, then shouldn't the intellectual tide go back out once COVID is in the rear view mirror? Shouldn't we expect old attitudes cautioning against excessive debts to now resurface? In a way, that's what we're now hearing from moderates in the US Congress. On the other hand, one could argue that the change in attitudes toward debt and deficits in the advanced economies predates COVID-19. Many economists warn against repeating the turn to premature austerity that took place after the global financial crisis. There is increasing awareness of the extent of inequality and social and economic fault lines in the advanced economies. There's growing acknowledgement of the need for government to provide public goods such as education, healthcare, basic research, transportation infrastructure, climate change, abatement, and adaptation, government programs and social services that markets don't adequately supply on their own. Historians of the United States talk about successive orders in the US. There was the New Deal order starting in the 1930s, which created a presumption that government would do more and spend more. There was then the neoliberal order, starting with, say, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, which created a presumption that government should do less and spend less. Could it be that we're now swinging back toward a New Deal order as a result of COVID and the pre-COVID discussions that I allude to above? That's the question in a way that is playing out in the editorial pages of US newspapers and in the US Congress at the moment. Another factor, as we economists know, is that lower interest rates have now made heavier debts more sustainable, as I argued before. So here is a close-up on interest payments as a share of GDP in the United States over a longer period than I showed you before. In the United States, federal government debt service cost only 2% of GDP in 2020, virtually unchanged from 20 years before, when debt in the hands of the public relative to GDP was barely a third as high. And interest rates on public debt are lower, not only in the US, but across the advanced country world. I was looking briefly at Turkey yesterday, and real interest rates on public debt are lower in Turkey today, despite all the noise around economic policy in the central bank and all that, than they were 10 or 20 years ago as well. So a common phenomenon that I show you here for a selection of European countries, even in Italy, gasp, the interest rate on public debt has come down quite dramatically in the course of the last 20 years. The question of the moment, of course, being whether these low interest rates in the advanced economies and globally will persist or not. And the answer depends on why you think interest rates are low. Do you think they're low because of the high savings of Germany, Saudi Arabia, fast-growing emerging markets such as China, as Mr. Bernanke, pictured at right, has argued? Would you argue that they're low because of growing inequality and high savings rates of the wealthy, as was argued at the Fed's Jackson Hole conference in August? Do you think interest rates are low because of the shift from manufacturing to services and from factories to digital platforms, which are less capital intensive, as Mr. Summers, pictured at the right, would argue? One can, in any case, imagine that some of these factors will now reverse as consumption as a share of GDP rises to more normal levels in China, as steps are taken to limit the increase of inequality in the United States and other advanced economies. So if the preconditions for low interest rates change, so too will the outlook for debt sustainability. Debt consolidation will become more urgent. So when we economists think about this, we think about the basic equation for the determination of debt dynamics, where the change in the debt to GDP ratio, little d, is a function of the government's accumulated future primary budget surpluses net of interest payments as a share of GDP, little p. The evolution of debt depends on inherited debt multiplied by the interest rate growth rate differential shown you on the right. And I apologize for a little bit of notational confusion there about the growth rate. And finally, everything else, which gets loaded into the stock flow adjustment. So we use this equation in the book to look at a number of successful debt consolidation episodes. For example, we look at the consolidation of British public debt in the century after the French and Napoleonic Wars. So this is a really remarkable picture. It shows you, number one, that the public debt ratio in the UK circa 1820 was like 200% of GDP. Number two, you can see how that debt ratio came down to 20% of GDP over the course of the succeeding century. And number three, you can see how this was achieved in large part. I'm going to show you entirely, as it happens, by running primary budget surpluses year after year after year, decade after decade after decade, for the better part of a century. So there's a little deficit here in 1901, 1902, during the time of the Boer War. But other than that, this political system was able to sustain large budget surpluses that were put to the purpose of retiring the inherited debt for generations, for the better part of a century. The implicit question, of course, being, could my political system or your political system do the equivalent today? I submit highly unlikely. There was a Victorian philosophy of sound finance that governments should retire in peacetime the debt incurred during wartime. There were intense worries about another future conflict with possibly the French, possibly the Germans. So retiring this debt was a way of restoring the ability to borrow during that future conflict. And there was limited influence of the working class, which would have wanted more government spending on social programs and the like in Parliament. So there were a couple of electoral reforms in the 1830s and in the 1860s. Still, the only men of property, creditors, in other words, were able to sit in Parliament, were able to elect members of Parliament, and you didn't get pressure to do otherwise until the turn of the century with the Fabian reformers and the like. Here we have an equivalent picture for the United States, where public debt was not as high, but it was essentially extinguished between the end of the US Civil War, 1867, here, and the eve of World War I, where this was done again by running primary budget surpluses year after year, decade after decade for half a century. How was that done? Again, strong creditor influence over politics. There were complaints about that creditor influence, so we had a populist movement in the United States that complained about the power of the bankers and the creditors and the trusts, which didn't succeed in electing its presidential candidate in 1896, didn't succeed in diluting the power of the creditors, if you will. After the Civil War, Southern states opposed more federal spending because they thought a more expansive federal government would interfere with the way the now former slave-holding South wanted to organize its social affairs. The US faced limited military spending needs prior to the Spanish-American War at the end of the century. So when people think about the American economy in the second half of the 19th century and how we successfully extinguished the federal government debt over this period, they assume it was the rapid growth of the economy, all the immigration that the US experienced, that it enjoyed in this period, that retired the debt. That is not correct. It was the primary surpluses instead that were responsible. So you can see that. Finally, one more case, and then I'll show you that numerically. Here's the case of France, which came out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, 1871, heavily indebted, which worked down that debt very significantly over the subsequent 20 years, again, by running primary budget surpluses, which the elites in the parliament saw as necessary to enable the country to prepare for another German war, which they saw looming. So in each of these cases, primary budget surpluses account for the entirety, more than 100% of the observed decrease in public debt. So the periods covered here differ, just like in the three graphs I showed you a moment ago. This is the decrease in the debt to GDP ratio over the period in question. So 165.8 is the difference between starting level and ending level. And here we see the contribution to that decrease of the primary budget balance, of the interest rate growth rate differential, and of everything else. And you can see even in the United States, famous for rapid growth in this period, the growth rate, interest rate differential contributed negatively to debt reduction over the period. The growth rate may have been fast, but the interest rate was even higher, is what I'm saying. The primary budget surpluses contributed more than the total observed reduction in public debt. And one other thing that's worth noting, I guess, is this number. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Goshen, in 1888 in Britain, did a debt buyback and conversion of the debt into lower interest rate debt that saved the Exchequer 25% of GDP over the subsequent period. So that's why the other things, the stock flow adjustments, stand out in the British case. We also look in the book at some other cases that you would not want to take as examples of what to do. In Britain, the dotted line here, after World War I, debt had risen to high levels. There was a difficult, largely inconclusive battle to agree on fiscal restraint, whose taxes on whom to raise, what public spending programs to cut. That led to political instability, the fall of the government in 1931, to financial instability, the collapse of the gold standard in 1931, to slow growth and high interest rates over the entire period. So there's little, if any, progress at debt consolidation in Britain in the 1920s and 1930s. And another case you wouldn't want to emulate was Weimar Germany after World War I, where the debt was wiped out basically by hyperinflation. And you can see its fall in 1922-23, but debt then begins to rise again because Germany is saddled with very high interest rates as a legacy of that, very high borrowing rates as a legacy of that hyperinflation. Finally, another case I would want to point to is successful debt consolidation in the advanced economies after World War II. So the precise period of debt consolidation varies across countries, and that's what the long footnote in the table details. But otherwise, the table is organized the same way as the one I showed you a moment ago. You can see very large declines depending on whether the sample of countries is weighted by GDP, country GDP or not, over the period. Other scholars have argued that debt consolidation was achieved in the third quarter of the 20th century in the advanced economies through a combination of fortuitously fast economic growth, catch-up growth, and financial repression. In other words, through the operation of the growth rate, interest rate differential. I point here to the primary balance as also being important. Fiscal restraint, fiscal effort, if you will, was an important part of this successful fiscal performance. Again, pointing to the implicit question about whether our economies are capable of something similar today. If one looks at economies since 1970, as Ugo Panissa and I did in a paper 5 or 6 years ago, we asked the question, can our economies run persistent primary surpluses over a substantial period of time. As in the historical cases I showed you previously, we asked how many economies can we find that have run primary budget surpluses as large as 5% of GDP for as long as 10 years. And we found only 3, each of which did so under very special, exceptional circumstances. Norway after 1999, Norway after it discovered large amounts of oil and natural gas in the North Sea that it wanted to put aside for future generations. Belgium after 1995. Belgium had the highest debt to GDP ratio in Europe, and it desperately wanted to be part of the Euro area. So it had to engage in exceptional fiscal consolidation to bring that high debt down. And Singapore, after 1990, Singapore has a strong technocratic government that is not subject to the political pressures that many other governments are subject to. And it's in a geopolitically difficult, delicate part of the world. So it wants to endow its sovereign wealth funds with a lot of resources to address those geopolitical problems. I would say also, Singapore has an unusually volatile economy, very small and very open, heavily dependent on things like pharmaceuticals, which are very volatile today, which means that it needs to put aside fiscal resources to deal with future shocks. So we find the behavior analogous to the historical behavior I showed you before of large primary surpluses for extended periods of time, only under very exceptional circumstances. Will our governments inflate away their debts? There are some, like my friend Charles Goodhart, who argue that they will, that the advanced economies, Charles is concerned with the UK case, but people make the argument more generally, are going to be running inflation rates of 5 or 10% now going forward because they are more heavily indebted. They want to bring the nominal growth rate up relative to the nominal interest rate. The objection to that point, to which I subscribe, is that the nominal interest rate is going to go up too, that investors are going to adjust maturities. So the increase in inflation will have to be a very big surprise, or there will have to be repeated surprises in the direction of higher inflation rates in order to be able to significantly reduce inherited debt stocks through inflation. And call me naive if you will, but I think that stability culture is deeply ingrained in most modern central banks. And our central bankers, to the extent that they remain independent, are going to resist significantly higher inflation. So in the United States, we may continue to see 3 or 4% inflation next year, but I would argue not more. What about faster economic growth? That would be the painful way of bringing down these heavy debts, growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. That's what Europe is hoping for with its recovery fund. That is what the Biden administration promises we will get in the United States through its infrastructure plan. Maybe COVID has accelerated digitization, so now that we can do seminars by Zoom, and now that my wife, the doctor, can do telehealth, we will see an acceleration in productivity growth, but there is no evidence of a durable acceleration of productivity growth in the statistics, period. And history of the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the personal computer, suggests that it takes a while, years or even decades, before the development of a new general purpose technology like the 3 at the right translate into significantly faster productivity growth. All of which is to say, and on this note, I will conclude, we don't think there are simple solutions to the heavier debts that have been inherited from history and most recently from the COVID crisis. that the problem of debt consolidation has to be addressed simultaneously on multiple fronts using multiple instruments. History shows that countries that have successfully addressed problems of debt sustainability without experiencing major economic, financial, and political dislocations have done so by exerting fiscal effort, turning to fiscal restraint when the time is right and not before, by growing their economies, and by avoiding deflation, maybe even running modest rates of inflation instead. And I think that history shows that failing to address the problem from all three angles is a recipe for disaster. So I hope I've represented both views of public debt adequately. The positive view maybe disproportionately in the first part of the talk, the more cautious view in the second, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Eichengreen, for this great introduction to your book. For my part, I'm looking forward to reading more in the book. The floor is now open to questions and comments. Please note that unless you are the co-host, you will not be able to unmute your microphone unless you write from the chat screen. So you can either type your questions on the chat screen, or you can ask for us to unmute you for your questions, or raise your hands for that matter. So Ulaş, let's start with you. You should be unmuted now.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and Professor, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Sorry, this evening for you. I have a few questions. The first one is about 2008, the global recession. You referred to 2008 crisis as an exception to the financial orthodoxy prevalent at the time. I'm just curious, what do you think about the COVID era increase in the debt? I mean, that will be again an exception to the financial orthodoxy, or this will be more permanent? This is the one question. And the other question is, in one of your graphs, you showed the increase in the debt GDP ratio in the emerging markets and other countries, and it's impossible not to see the difference between the emerging markets and others, because in the emerging markets the ratio is increasing much faster. So should we worry about that? I mean, in terms of the prospect of maybe some debt problems for the emerging economies in the future. So what do you make of that? And finally, one more question. This is about there's a lot of talk about the rise of populism and the right-wing movements in much of the world, and how globalization, I mean, much of the population, particularly the old working class and some sections of the population, didn't really benefit from the globalization, and they now support Trump in the US and Le Pen in France and other countries. So do you think how all these developments, the political developments, will translate into this financial orthodoxy, or in general the social programs and the transfer payments programs of the governments in the world? I mean, I feel like they will continue to increase, or they will not easily give up on increasing the social programs or the transfer payments in the future. What do you think of that?
That's a lot, is what I think. A rich set of questions. We do have an extended discussion in the book about the connections between democratization and public debt. The wonderful institution that is democracy also makes many things more difficult. And one of the things it makes more difficult is debt management. And I alluded to that in my discussion of those three 19th century cases. It can intensify the pressure for public spending programs, and at the same time, intensify resistance from those groups that might be capable of paying higher taxes to finance those programs from doing so. I think, as I also alluded to in the talk, I think political polarization in democratic societies creates a bias toward deficit spending and makes fiscal consolidation and successful debt management more difficult. I have some other work that we don't talk about in the book that looks at fiscal performance and governmental stability under different electoral systems. So how that political polarization plays out depends in part on the electoral system. So I look to the case of Germany, for example, where because of a proportional representation system rather than a first past the post system, they're able to deal with the potential for political polarization and still form centrist, durable centrist coalition governments that end up being in a better position to forge the compromises that are needed for successful debt management. So the connections between politics and debt management are complicated. Those are some of the things that I think of immediately when you ask me to ponder those issues. In terms of debt management challenges in emerging markets and developing countries going forward, they are going to be intense. So people think about them in the context of the possibility of another taper tantrum. So a lot of emerging markets are better placed to deal with the impending normalization of Federal Reserve policy rates than they were in 2013. And the Fed is trying to more carefully telegraph what it's going to do going forward so as not to wrong foot debt managers and Treasury officials in emerging markets. But I think as US interest rates are going to go up, some emerging markets are inevitably going to experience debt management problems. The countries that I'm most worried about, that everyone is most worried about, are the low income countries, where vaccination rates are lowest, where supply chain problems and protectionism bite the hardest, and where I think growth problems going forward are going to be create serious challenges for debt management, where the DSSI, the steps that the G20 has taken to try to deal with the indebtedness problems of low-income countries have been insufficient, to put it mildly.
Erinç Hocam.
Thank you. Barry, in some of your work, you have talked about the concept of misalignment in exchange rates. Now that in response to Ulaş's question, we are talking about the emerging markets, and in Turkey, one of the real problems is, of course, the third price of money, in addition to the inflation rate or the inverse of it, the real interest rate, and the behavior of the real exchange rate, which is of paramount importance. And in your misalignment conceptualization, you have indicated that rather than the usual phrasing of appreciation, depreciation, or the old jargon, straight out devaluation, you have stated that the equilibrium could be maintained in the foreign exchange markets, but the exchange rate may itself be misaligned with the structural factors. If I have read your writings well enough, that's suitable. Would you be commenting upon that route from the point of view of the emerging market literature about the role of the fiscal debt and how it will come into play?
So I'm happy to see Professor Belden. I enjoyed seeing your cat walk across the screen while I was talking. I haven't, so we don't really talk about that in the book in connection with public debt. I've done some work in the past looking at the role of the real exchange rate in economic growth. And both in specific country contexts, I've done some work on South Korea, where a competitively valued real exchange rate was a key element of its successful economic growth, and more broadly in a cross-section of countries. So the historical argument is that a competitive real exchange rate is important for growing light manufacturing and then heavier manufacturing in a way that allows labor to be transferred out of the primary sector and into the manufacturing sector, at which point you get hopefully modern sustained economic growth. So I did the work in question like 15 years ago, and I think there is an issue now about whether changes in technology and changes in the world economy are kind of foreclosing that route. Are robots going to replace low-wage workers? Is a simple-minded way of putting it. Is the traditional argument for worrying about the level of the exchange rate in connection with growth policy, is that traditional argument still valid today or not?
Okay, so there is a question from Sinan Yıldırım. Let me unmute. Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering, how do you think that public debt is going to affect income distribution in those countries with increasing public debt in the longer term?
I don't know that I have a good answer to that. There has been a large literature now on trends in inequality and the rise of inequality across the advanced economies, for example. And so far as I know, the level of public debt does not appear in any of those studies. I think what we know, I was involved, for example, in a project that the IMF has done on inclusive growth. What we know is that government policy, fiscal policy, is very important for the development of inequality. But what's important is what government spends on, who government taxes, as opposed to the level of public debt. So I need to find someone on this Zoom call or one of my students who can go back to those studies and see if there is, in addition, a role for public debt. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer offhand.
So there's a question on the chat screen from Deniz Kozanoğlu, whose mic's not working properly, so I'll just read it on his behalf. Dear Professor Eichengreen, thank you very much for this great presentation and great discussion. Your presentation perfectly reflected how debts become a mechanism for countries to acquire and appropriate wealth. But what if we actually experience a systemic debt crisis as a result of the new dynamics and monetary, financial, and technological innovations of the 21st century, such as the emergence of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, decentralized finance, etc., and the losses in national economies, the deterioration in macroeconomic indicators, the significant increase in inflation rates and debt, and the uncertainty brought by COVID-19?
I'm tempted to say, can you read that again, please?
Yes, of course. Sure. So it goes. Your presentation perfectly reflected how that has become a mechanism for countries to acquire and appropriate wealth. But what if we experience a systemic debt crisis as a result of the new dynamics and monetary, financial, and technological innovations of the 21st century, such as the emergence of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, decentralized finance, etc., and the losses in national economies, the deterioration in macroeconomic indicators, the significant increase in inflation rates and debt, and the uncertainty brought by COVID-19.
So macroeconomic volatility and the uncertainty associated with COVID-19, problems that may be with us for a while, we don't know, clearly make successful debt management more difficult. No question about that. So again, I showed you cases like the advanced economies after World War II, where sustained, rapid by historical standards, stable economic growth was associated with debt consolidation and debt reduction. So if we're no longer in that world, but instead in a world of greater volatility and uncertainty, that will make debt management just more difficult, just like it'll make everything else more difficult. I have another strand of work where I think about the crypto sphere. My interests are mainly in stable coins and central bank digital currencies, and not in plain vanilla cryptocurrencies. I do not think that they have first order implications for debt management, debt issuance, and the like. So they may have first order implications down the road for payment systems, for monetary policy, for financial stability, conceivably. But for debt management, I do not see the connections.
Ümit Hocam, you can now unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you see any risk of, let's say, premature fiscal consolidation attempt in the US or in the Eurozone. Thank you.
Yes, I do. I see a danger that the recovery that now seems to be underway in the United States and Europe, we hope, could be derailed by fiscal drag. In other words, on current law, if nothing else is done, the budget deficit as a share of GDP will decline between 2021 and 2022 in the United States from 13% of GDP to 6% of GDP. So that's taking 7% of spending away all in 1 year. Could that throw the recovery off track? If it does, I would call that, I would label that as having been premature fiscal consolidation. And similarly, if Germany goes all the way from a budget deficit of more than 5% of GDP to zero next year, and that throws recovery in Europe off track, historians will write about that in the future as another example of premature fiscal consolidation. So number one, we don't know what changes in the law, changes in fiscal policy are going to come out of the US Congress and so forth going forward. Number two, we don't know whether the less expansionary fiscal policy that's undoubtedly coming will in fact throw recovery off course. So I don't want to predict that we're about to see more premature austerity, but I do wonder about the possibility. And I do not think at the moment that a debt to GDP ratio of 100% in the United States, forecast on current law to rise to 109% of GDP in 2030, is necessarily unsustainable or out of control or requires dramatic fiscal consolidation. Now, I think there is a worry because we don't know what's going to happen to growth rates and interest rates going forward. But there's also a worry from a sharp move in the direction of fiscal consolidation right now.
I have a question. Since there are no hands, let me take the opportunity to ask it. I have a question regarding the Eurozone countries. So since 2009, due to this heterogeneity in the balance of payments of these countries, the debates of a fiscal union have been revived. What is your take on this, and how do you see the prospects of a fiscal union in the Eurozone?
I think this is another example of our collective uncertainty about what's going to happen after COVID. So before COVID, meaningful fiscal union or significant steps in the direction of fiscal federalism, a large EU budget were politically unthinkable. There were economists like us who would talk about the advantages of having a fiscal union to accompany the monetary union, but it was a political non-starter in Germany and elsewhere. And then in 2020, the EU agreed to an 850 billion euro recovery plan, where the European Union, rather than individual member states, would issue bonds in that amount to help finance the green and digital transformation and recovery of the European Union from the COVID crisis. So was that a one-time event, a one-off in response to an exceptional pandemic? Or was it a recognition that this is something that the EU needs to continue to do going forward, given the more volatile economic and financial environment we now all are faced with? We don't know the answer to that question yet. The European Commission right now, as we speak, is tabling some ideas about how the way they refer to it is that the EU budget and the budgets of the member states need to be integrated more extensively. We need more fiscal coordination between the member states and the EU. That's politically correct European language for continuing to expand the EU budget. But whether there will be an agreement from national governments to do that, the rest of us have to wait and see.
I guess we don't have any more questions. Let me ask the audience again whether there's someone who has a question. In this case, I think we can conclude the seminar. Thank you again very much for this inspiring, stimulating talk, Professor Eichengreen. We are hoping to be hosting you in person in Istanbul for the next one.
It's my hope as well. Good questions. Thank you all for patience and your interest. And have a good evening.
Thank you very much also for your participation. Have a good evening or a good afternoon.